welcome everyone. This is our National Academy Ask Me Anything webinar for Spring 2022. I'm Keith Molenaar. I'm an NAC member and a professor here at the University of Colorado Boulder. It's really a pleasure to be with you tonight. The National Academy of Construction was established to recognize our industry leaders. An important purpose of the Academy is to provide a network system of linkage between the past and present participants within our construction industry. As such, we've established the NAC AMA to help transfer knowledge to our next generation of construction leaders, and that's you here tonight. So again, thanks for joining us. The format for our AMA is simple. Our speakers make a short presentation about a topic and their perspective on the industry. If you've not already, please email your questions to nacama@colorado.edu. I'll put that in the chat here in just a moment as well, but nacama@colorado.edu. I'll be reading those questions, and by sending that email in, you'll be eligible for a $500 scholarship, which we'll announce at the end of the event. So it's my pleasure to introduce Joseph Aiello. Joe is a recently retired partner, board member, and former senior fellow at the Meridiam Infrastructure, and a past chairman of the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority. He holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and an MS degree in city and regional planning from Harvard University. Joe's also currently a senior fellow at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, where he is focusing on the intersection of climate change, infrastructure, and finance. He previously served as president of AECOM Enterprises, one of our larger engineering firms in the world, where he led the company's global public-private partnership P3 business. And the result of his work was the creation of Meridiam Infrastructure, a fund management development company that invests exclusively in P3 projects. In 2015, he was appointed to a 5-year pro bono term by Governor Charles Baker of Massachusetts to chair the MBTA Fiscal and Management Control Board and to help set the MTBA on a course of operational excellence and fiscal sustainability. His major accomplishments included a dramatic reduction in operational losses, improved services, and accelerated capital investment. He has extensive expertise in strategic planning, business development, relationship management systems, finance, real estate, and investments. Joe, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us tonight and share some of your reflections on the industry and answer the many questions that are coming in. So at this point, I'll turn it over to you to reflect a little bit and let me know when you're ready to share your graphic. I'll go ahead and do that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Keith. And thank you to everybody for tuning in. I'm on the East Coast, so I might say good evening, and you might be in a different time zone, so recognizing that. What I thought I'd do is spend a couple of minutes just describing a couple of steps in my career and some themes that became more pronounced as my career moved on. And then a little bit about the founding of Meridiam and how Meridiam works, as well as how the public-private partnership world tries to work and what it tries to accomplish. And when we get to that part, we have a complicated graphic that everybody is going to have to memorize, and there'll be a brief test at the end. So I had been doing other things besides infrastructure and went back and got my master's degree and ended up working at the Transit Authority in Boston, Massachusetts, in the development section, where we would typically do planning studies, environmental impact statements, etc. I was there for 10 years, and over the 10 years, I realized that there was more fun in actually getting involved in the design and construction management processes. So I took that path. Then left out at the 10-year mark to go work for AECOM and progress through the ranks, bringing the public sector experience and how the public sector views public infrastructure, made sure that the private company I was working for, AECOM, sort of understood those perspectives. And I think one of the things that struck me when I made that transition was that when you're sitting inside a public enterprise, the capital delivery, whether it's design and construction, whether it's traditional or alternative delivery systems, really you're working for someone who's going to operate the system and going to have to live with the results for a long, very long period of time. And in the consulting, engineering, and construction management world I had moved into in the private sector, we didn't see that focus, nor were the clients asking us to think about the operation and maintenance period writ large. One of the dilemmas around public infrastructure is that by nature, you are getting your money from government, you're getting the money from the taxpayers, and that money usually circles through a whole bunch of elected officials, whether it's the legislature of your state, the federal government's legislature, or chief executive officers such as the president or a governor or a mayor. And what you'll see if you were to look at budgets around the country is no surprise to most of you. You can get a lot of money for capital projects because they present opportunities for groundbreaking ceremonies and getting a picture in the paper, and everybody claims that they were the one that helped make the project possible so they can get reelected. And there's also ribbon cutting ceremonies when everything is ready to open up and run that first train or bus or plane or whatever it might be. But in terms of providing the resources to ensure that those capital assets actually are able to provide that service to the intended customer over the long term is something close to starvation in many places. It's just not a glamorous part of the business. And when elected officials, and I'm not condemning them, this is part of their life, and by the way, this is a global problem, have a choice between putting money into shiny new objects versus maintaining something that already exists. The tendency is that one recognizes how to elected officials like to see the shiny new object, and maintenance is underserved. There was a bit of a wake-up call many years ago when Great Britain was going through an outsourcing and privatizing of its economy. A gentleman by the name of Tony Blair came in to be prime minister, and he was taking a tour of schools that were built by his predecessor that were 7 to 9 years old, and taking tours of these buildings and recognizing that roofs were leaking, air conditioning wasn't working, heat wasn't working, there were cracks in the foundation, things that should not appear in a 10-year-old building for certain. And he wondered about whether or not it was possible to harness the private sector in a different configuration so that the private sector was rewarded not just for building the asset up front, but making sure that that asset was operable over the long period of time. So in other words, thinking about a design, build, operate, maintain environment where one enterprise was going to make money, not just on the upfront construction period, but really get paid if that road or tunnel or building, etc., was able to serve the public as intended over its natural life cycle. And that really helped birth what's called the P3 business, the public-private partnership business. So Keith, if you'd be so kind as to put up a graphic, that might be a helpful transition to talk a little bit about P3s and what P3s intend to do. So here's what your test is going to be about. Just kidding. What people talk about when they talk about P3s is, again, how to focus on holding one enterprise with multiple parts responsible and accountable for making sure that that school building, or in this case that we're looking at, a courthouse, operates almost as new 25, 35, 50 years downstream as it does on the day that it opens up. And they are truly protecting the taxpayer interest of the original capital dollars that went into it. Instead of letting the building become neglected and deteriorate and age prematurely, people wanted to experiment with ways of holding the private sector more accountable for the performance of an asset over the long term. This runs counter to what one typically hears. One typically hears the public-private partnerships are an attempt to just give things over to the private sector so the private sector can make a lot of money. But if you're sitting on the government side and you construct these teams correctly and these competitive procurements correctly, you can extract a lot more value on behalf of the public sector and on behalf of your taxpayer than in some of the traditional models. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening in this graphic. First of all, the city of Long Beach, up at the top, the county of Los Angeles, and the judicial courts of California came together in partnership to say that they needed a brand new courthouse in Long Beach County. So a competitive procurement was initiated. Meridiam, the firm that I worked for at the time, raises money to invest in public-private partnerships and also acts as the quote-unquote developer and leads teams trying to secure and then implement these projects. So Meridiam Infrastructure on its own created an LLC, that is that green box in the middle, Long Beach Judicial Partners. Now, on the left-hand side where Meridiam is, frequently we would have other partners in the deal. There have been some toll roads down in Texas, which were $3 billion, and in order to come up with enough equity, typically there might be 2 or 3 partners in that red box off to the left-hand side. So we would provide the equity, we would provide the project leadership, and the right-hand side are the lenders into the project. And financing a PPP project at its root is not much more different than buying a home. In a home, you have a down payment, and then you have a mortgage. For most of us normal people, we don't pay cash. So Meridiam is the equity provider. That's the down payment that goes into the transaction that makes it possible. And the senior lenders, whether they are banks or bonds, participating just as a mortgage lender would enter into it. If you own a house and you start defaulting on your mortgage, the first thing that's at risk is the equity you put into your home, right? If God forbid that project is taken over by the bank, they'll wipe out your equity first and then try to recover as much of the debt as possible. Same thing in the Meridiam infrastructure business or our competitors or our allies in the field. We have the riskiest money in there, and therefore it's going to be the highest returns are going to be sought for by the highest risk money. And what we try to do is we try to minimize the amount of equity in that deal and maximize the amount of lending into a deal, because the lending is actually less expensive interest rates, and therefore they make us more competitive vis-a-vis the other teams that are bidding on the project. Then I want you to go straight down from the green box to a light blue box that says operating service provider, Johnson Controls, and then on the right-hand side, design builder, and again here it has Clark Design Builder of California. So what we do is we go out and seek a design builder who can create the physical manifestation of the program that our public client wanted to create. And we also bring on board at the same time someone who's actually going to operate and maintain that building over the lifetime of the contract. And for us, the contract was 35 years. So our responsibility is to build it. And then once the operating period begins, we're operating it for 35 years. We want to make sure that the design builder and the operating folks who are doing all this work on their own nickel during the bid period are achieving through the design and operating strategies the lowest net present value of cost for the construction and the 35-year operating period. So we don't look at this through the lens of the lowest upfront cost. We look at this through the lens of the lowest net present value of life cycle cost, and whoever has the lowest life cycle cost presented to the government ends up being the winner. So the design builder will offer up a 30% design. They'll price it, their 30% design for a fixed price. Johnson Controls will look at that. They'll understand what they're going to be operating, what all the equipment in the building is going to be. They're going to give us a firm price for operating the building. Now, on certain things like energy, they'll commit to a risk profile on energy consumption, but not energy costs, because energy costs are just not predictable over a long period of time. And there's a coordination agreement that runs between the two. When the design builder presents their plans, they are locked in to having to build exactly that, because the operating services provider has based their price for the operating period on exactly that set of design build plans. The operating service provider watches the design builder in the field to make sure that they are actually delivering precisely what was in their design build contracts. And then once the design builder has completed their work and their normal warranties have expired, they are gradually transferring over full control of the building to the operating services provider. So therefore, there's a coordination agreement that manages the interface risk between the design build team and the operating team. You notice Meridiam is not a party to that arrangement. That's strictly a technical arrangement that runs between design build and the O&M period. So the magic in this in this kind of schematic is that from the public enterprises up at the front end, they are running a procurement that is going to guarantee a level of performance that they pick for the buildings, i.e., even on the warmest days of the year, on the sunny side of the building in those courtrooms, the temperature controls will ensure that the temperatures will never get above 71 degrees. If they get above 71 degrees, fines are leveled. Those fines eventually come back and deduct from Meridiam infrastructure. If 15 years from now, the building skin is failing, that is not the responsibility of the government to fix it. It's the responsibility of the enterprise to fix it on their own nickel. And again, that will deteriorate Meridiam's returns on this. So the leverage over performance is held by the public sector. The private sector, if it has priced their work correctly and they can implement their work correctly, absolutely can make a profit. But it is at significant risk over long-term building performance. So that's sort of I just wanted to present an idea of sort of what happens in the PPP world a little bit more granularly than traditionally. And hopefully between what I've done in life and that short discourse, there'll be some questions that I can answer.
Well, thank you, Joe. That's really interesting and I think extremely informative. We have a wonderful background and of folks here who have different questions. I'm going to start with some of the P3 related questions to kind of continue that along. Folks have done their homework. They also want to ask you some questions about the intersection of sustainability and infrastructure. We have some other questions just on some general reflections on career and what it takes to be successful in our industry. So we'll try and hit all of these, but looking forward to it here. So let me ask you the first one. So Adriana asks a question: any tips you would give a student who eventually wants to work in the business development side of engineering?
Sure, the business development side of engineering. I think, first of all, you have to know what the client base is going to be. So if you're in a particular industry serving oil and gas, you really need to understand the oil and gas business from the shareholder level through the executive decision, through their strategic plan. You really got to learn somebody else's business, not just be an expert in being able to design and build widgets. You really have to understand how that widget fits into their larger enterprise and trying to reach profitability if that's what it is. If you're serving public clients, you really need to become somewhat a student of government. You really need to understand the difference between their operating budgets and their capital budgets. You need to understand what a 5-year capital improvement program budget looks like, the kinds of money that are committed in that budget, the kinds of money that are fungible. So it would be to sort of really understand the business of your client, so that when you are speaking with them, you can understand exactly what they're trying to accomplish with their engineering construction programs that will improve operations of the company, operations of the public enterprise, profitability in the one case, productivity gains in the case of improved government performance.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, that comprehensive knowledge, similar to what you're talking about with structuring a P3 deal as well, right? Understanding that whole life cycle and what the client needs as service. Along the P3 lines, Wyatt is asking, how prevalent do you foresee P3s being in the public transportation infrastructure sector? So I know you showed us a courthouse here, but so on the infrastructure side, what are your thoughts?
Sure. Well, it's a tool in the toolbox, so I don't think it's ever going to be the dominant delivery system, but it certainly is. It certainly is one of the many delivery systems. And my recommendation, particularly when you're beginning your career, is to not get trapped into specializing in any one particular delivery system. Rather than becoming a specialist in, say, P3s or design build, become facile to be able to understand what's the difference between design bid build, CM at risk, and a whole bunch of other delivery mechanisms, what it means to have finance in a deal, what it doesn't mean to what it means to not have finance in a deal, what is the purpose of private financing. So I would not worry about the future of any particular delivery system, because I think you're going to see a lot of tools in your career. You want to be facile enough to be able to have a conversation with your clients, with your peers, about what the right tool is for the given challenge that you're facing around the project.
So, yeah, great discussion. Just my own question, do you always see design build with P3 projects, or is the design and construction sometimes done through construction management at risk or other mechanisms?
Pretty much it's a design build, because if there's finance in the deal, you have to have a firm price, and design build gives you the first price. CM at risk gets close, but the price they give you is not a bankable number, because there is some flexibility going forward. So hard prices are required both on the O&M side as well as the capital construction side in order to be able to arrange a financing.
Thank you. Let me do one more on P3 here. Julio's asking, well, let me just summarize it, maybe to give you a broader opportunity to answer. Why do P3 projects fail, and at what points have you seen them be canceled?
Well, they fail just like other projects fail, I would say that. And why do P3 projects fail? I think commonly because sometimes it's a shortcut for people who think that there's a free lunch out there. Oh, let's let the private sector develop it, the private sector finance it, and that sounds like great, 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 great. But I'm not in the business to run a charity, right? If I'm going to put my money into a project, I need to figure out how I'm going to get my money back, plus make a profit. So frequently you see a very immature understanding by government of P3s. And so they'll take a project which otherwise, let's say, couldn't achieve approval in a tax referendum that's put before the public. And they think that there's a short-term way of doing this contractually. And then the public realizes, oh my God, this is just a backdoor way of not asking for a referendum for a tax increase in order to build the project, but we're going to be contractually obligated for payments over the next 20 years or 30 years. That's a frequent cause for failure and failure upfront. The second thing is, it depends upon when you decide to procure a project. I constantly recommend to public clients who ask me, wait until you're pretty close to having a record of decision or similar event where you've passed through your broad-based environmental processes and you've come out with a clean bill of health. You are less likely to face lawsuits past that point. Your lawsuits are more defensible if they come past that point, and projects are much, much harder to start. If you try to get a P3 deal procured before the record of decision comes, a couple of things are true. All those things that I said you're vulnerable on, you're more vulnerable, but also the scope can change, right? And between the publications of the final EIS and the record of decisions, there may be additional orders of conditions and other requirements placed on the project. Now, I'm the successful developer. I've given you a fixed price for X. Now you're going to asking me to actually build X double prime. There's going to have to be a discussion about what that costs. We're no longer in a competitive environment because I'm the declared winner. The other two teams went home and they've disbanded. So sometimes that discussion gets a little bit heated. A little bit of lack of trust sets in. So the timing of when a PPP developer is brought in and the project awarded to them can make a big difference in terms of failure rate as well.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate that that answer. Very comprehensive. So related to this, but more along skills, Kunal's asking, what are the essential skills students should develop on the business side? Most of them are in design and construction, either engineering or CM firms here today. How do you suggest that they develop that business acumen and the business side?
Yep. Certainly, whether you're going to be oriented towards private work or public work, you should understand finance. You should understand project finance. You know, how does an apartment building or a condominium building or a football stadium work on its economics, right? So having exposure to finance, in particular project finance, is important. If you think you're going to have public sector exposure in terms of clients, certainly public budgeting and public finance, which is its own world of bonds, et cetera, to finance capital construction projects. I would at minimum have those two kinds of skill sets in your bank. Never hurts, by the way, and it's usually a precondition to be able to take those courses to have some basic accounting principles locked down as well.
Great, yeah, thanks for discussing those skills. And I hope everybody here is thinking about being a continuous learner throughout your career as well. Education doesn't stop when you graduate from high school or college either. So let's shift a little bit more towards your work in sustainability and cities and such. Paul is asking about what's actually involved in a comprehensive plan for a city or looking forward in that. Is that something you can address?
Not my cup of tea, to be honest. I would say this though, particularly in the larger cities, we're going through, it depends upon what part of the country you're in, because some are farther along than other places. We're going through an environment where the economy is going to change as a result of climate change. And really around the two principles, the notion of decarbonizing our economy. I think we saw the latest IPCC report just came out that we're way behind on decarbonizing the global economy. This is going to hit the big cities first. It's hitting in certain communities as well. But you're going to have to go to green renewables. You're going to have redundant systems. The grid is going to have to be updated and reinforced. I mean, just think about this simply from a diesel locomotive driven commuter rail system. Right now, if one commuter rail train runs out of diesel fuel, well, that train is stranded, right? And that's all that happens. There's a little bit of disruption. You're going to have to do some crossovers. There may be some delays. But once you electrify the entire system, if you lose access to the grid, you have lost the entire system, right? So you've got to think about redundancy. You got to think about resiliency to make sure that you don't allow yourself to have massive failures. And that means that transit authorities have to work with utility systems. They have to work with communities for the location of multiple entry points of power into the system so you can achieve that. A lot more environmental clearances are going to happen. So for me, I think whether it's the resiliency topic or the decarbonization topic, that is likely to drive a lot of infrastructure discussion in the large metropolitan areas over the next 20, 30 years.
Well, wonderful. You've hit a couple answers to the questions I was going to ask from Alex and Tulupe. Maybe can you talk about how a large design and construction firm should be changing in the future to address those, and maybe just generally about how strategic planning works for a large engineering or construction organization?
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about sort of matching what I was talking about with Meridiam, which is that we don't tend the public tends not to maintain things really, really well. If you go to places, coastal cities in particular, or cities along major waterways that are also somewhat exposed, but San Francisco, Miami, Boston, New York, etc., with rising sea levels and storm surges that have to be worried about, what we're seeing is a sort of an accelerated pace of building seawalls, building berms, trying to make sure that the ocean can't come in during storm surges. And if sea level rise by a foot, as what's predicted over the next number of decades, that is not going to negatively impact the environment. What you find you have very little discussion about is the fact that usually the waterfront has multiple owners. Sometimes they're private owners, sometimes they're public owners. And there's variations, obviously, in the waterfront. And if I build a seawall here, it may have repercussions of my neighbor on the other side of a small inlet. And we've got to think about a whole bunch of things when it comes to strengthening ourselves against storm surges and increased sea levels, particularly along the two coasts. And that is, what is the potential for unintended consequences from the sequence of investments that you're making to make sure that there aren't any? More importantly, what is going to be the inspection regime and the maintenance regime for assets that are going to be built either in the public domain or on private sections of property, right? It's not like the old days where you can allow a waterfront house to just deteriorate and nobody lives there anymore and has been abandoned. If you have a seawall that is continuous for, let's say, 20 miles, and there's one fella who is just not maintaining a seawall, well, guess what? The rest of the seawalls are almost irrelevant if the ocean starts pouring in at storm surge or very high king tides, right? So there's a whole world out there of trying to get the public sector to understand that you really need to instill program management, asset management, and other kinds of techniques to make sure that what is going to be built is going to be the right technical solution, where things are going to be built in the right sequence, and that there's going to be a maintenance and intervention protocol to make sure those things stay in a sound state of good repair over the long term. Engineering firms need to think about how to have those conversations with public clients and private clients. And that's going to be a big shift, I think, culturally for them, but a lot of business opportunities for them. And I'm sorry, Keith, that was sort of the second part of the question. Could you repeat the first part of the question?
No, I think you really got it. Just
Okay.
a little bit about, maybe you could address a little bit more about just what is strategic planning in a large organization, and how is it done?
Yeah, so strategic planning generally is a look forward to analyze what the current market opportunities look like, but also project 5 years and 10 years downstream to see how your market might change. It also looks at, as that change is happening, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What's the competitive field? Do you see different kinds of firms trying to come into your business? In other words, are construction companies trying to become more program managers, whereas the engineering firms have been program managers. So strategic planning looks for changes in the market. It looks for the strengths and weaknesses that you bring to that evolving market over time, creates a plan for how to take advantage of your strengths and how to compensate for your weaknesses. Do we need to hire people in, make up a topic, environmental planning, or should we go out and buy an environmental planning engineering firm so we can understand the very early stages of some of these big projects that are coming forward? And again, always understanding what the competitive landscape looks like and what you need to do to adjust to make sure you keep or increase your market share.
Great, thank you. Let me ask you the last one, kind of in this energy efficient green construction, either for buildings or infrastructure, and that's interested in getting involved in that aspect of our design and construction industry. So for a new employee, how would you say they can make inroads into that portion of our industry?
Into the green infrastructure element of it. Well, I mean, a big piece of it is the due diligence of what firms are actually doing to examine the kind of projects that they are involved in. That would certainly be one. I would say this as well. Don't be afraid of a little bit of public service. You know, just like you want to make sure you pick the right private firm, not all public service is equal, right? And I think if you can find a community, or more importantly, a project that looks like it's a critical project for that metropolitan area with respect to the greening of that economy or the protection of that community, given the threats that are forecast for it. Don't be afraid of diving into the public sector for a couple of good years of training. I did that. That made a big difference for me. I went into the transit authority and in an environment where there was, it sounds like it was today, a lot of federal money coming in. There was really a lack of capacity within the public sector. And I ended up, compared to my peers, ending up after 5 years with much, much more responsibility than some of my peers did. They were making more money than me during that period of time, but I ended up with much more responsibility 5 to 7 years out than they did, simply because on the government side, if you show you've got a little bit of chutzpah and you're willing to sort of stay after 5 o'clock, you get noticed real fast, right? And you can make a bigger impact and you can have a nicer portfolio after that 5 to 7 year period. Again, you have to be able to sustain a lower salary base over time, but it can certainly pay dividends. Don't necessarily be afraid of those opportunities.
Thank you, Joe. That's wonderful advice. You were just talking a little bit about your public sector experience there. Berlinda's asking a question about the Green Line extension. Is that something you would talk about?
Yeah.
Just kind of paraphrase it here, but how do you balance fiscal responsibility, financial constraints, safety, all in a complex project like that with so many different elements. Can you just talk a little bit about that project and how you meet the different goals?
Sure, sure. Well, the first thing is safety. It has to be number one, it has to stay number one. You can never compromise it on it. And that has to be viewed as full life safety, right? It's not just the safety of the people in the field who are building the asset, but it's going to be the safety of the operators, the safety of the users. You've got to screen for safety and make safety your number one priority, and never, never, ever, ever deviate from that, because people die. I hate to be that blunt about it. People get really injured, and they get injured for life. And then everything else is really an optimization thing, right? You try to understand the amount of resources you've got to attack a certain project. So the Green Line extension, as an example, we wanted to run 2 branches out into the cities of Somerville and Medford. There were a certain number of stations that people wanted. You know, you got to make sort of first large grain decisions. Do I actually have enough money to be able to build all 11 stations? Should I just build 7 of them first and build them well, and make sure I'm leaving the enterprise such that people can put infill stations in later when we have more money, but make sure that the stations I have built have proper access for drop-offs of buses and kiss and ride lots, parking facilities, etc. So you're building a good base of operations, that you have an appropriate landscaping so people feel free approaching the facility. You can do sound walls so that the neighborhood doesn't feel antagonistic towards the asset, etc. So, and then you get into the individual stations, and you know, you really want to value engineer the stuff, right? You want to look at the platform configurations. Can I get a center platform? What does that mean? And can I reduce the number of elevators or escalators? Those are always high price ticket items. Those kinds of things. I think ease of maintenance is something else that you always want to do. You always want to make sure you can get emergency vehicles onto the system should there be a crash or a breakdown. You want to make sure you got adequate runarounds in case there is a breakdown in any of the vehicles on the system, and they can keep operating. So that's sort of just the general approach. Is safety number one, and number two, you usually end up with a fixed bucket of money, and you have to make first large scale decisions to stay within budget, and then small scale decisions as you dive deeper into the project. Let me, if I could say one other thing.
Oh, please do.
You know, the Green Line extension was a case of, you know, it was a project that had been around for a long time, and it failed to get implemented. And the folks that came in before us, before we got there, were running out of time. And they selected a delivery mechanism, which was called the CMGC at risk kind of thing. And it was something that the authority had never used. The reason they picked that was because you could sign a contract and have a number associated with the contract and make it look like the project was inevitable. They were worried that the next governor was coming in and wasn't going to be a fan of the project. But guess what happened? The T had never used it. They had no one trained to use it. They didn't send anyone to school to use it. They hired a consulting consortium that actually didn't have the experience in it. They had sort of other multi-alphabet type experience in it. And the project blew up on them. What should have been a just over $2 billion project was penciling out as an over $3 billion project. Within 6 months of signing a contract with the federal government called a full funding grant agreement. By all rights, that project should have been canceled. But the transit authority was in a state where it had everything going wrong all at the same time. There were a lot of calls to cancel that project. But as a board, we had to look at it and say, okay, if we walk away from $1 billion of federal funding, this is back in 2016, and just sort of hand it back, that's going to be a signal to the federal government that we can't get our act together. Number one. Number two is going to be a signal internally to the folks at the T, the men and women at the T, we're all really good professionals, that we're going to accept failure. And number three, it's going to be awful hard to recruit, to build a sense of excitement if you want to do great things with the authority. So we took a chance and said, no, we're going to fix it. We brought in new consultants, brought in new people. We brought people with no relationship to the firm. God forbid, in Boston, we actually hired a law firm out of LA to help improve the commercial terms around design build documents, just simply because we didn't want any connectivity between the local law firms and the local contractors who we knew were going to bid on the job. So sometimes you have to take risks when they don't pencil out on the economics. Sometimes there's strategic reasons for needing to do something when you're in the public sector, and even in the private sector, it happens from time to time. So don't always let numbers rule your day. They're important. Sometimes you got to think about the broader strategy and the broader strategic implementations of the decisions that are put before you.
Thank you, Joe. That was a really good answer. And I have to say, when I paraphrased for Linda's original question, she did highlight public safety, just like you did at the beginning there. So
good for her. Good for her.
I appreciate
that's great.
Putting that through first. So, we are really running to the end here quickly. So, but I have so many great questions. Let me ask you, there's a kind of a series of questions around just career advice. Maybe you could give me some real quick answers to a couple questions. How does that sound?
Sure.
Okay, so then we'll do that, and then we'll wrap up and get to the scholarship winner here in just a few minutes. So let's see. From Travis, what has been the most enjoyable, rewarding accomplishment you've had in the industry?
Working for great bosses.
Excellent, excellent. And how did you choose a great boss? Did you know, or did it just happen?
Due diligence. I was taught that young. Do your due diligence on a boss. Talk to everyone you possibly can around that person. People are their boss. People have worked for them. People are colleagues for them. Check that out. That's the single most important indicator, I think, of being able to advance your career, to really learn, etc. Test your possible boss.
Excellent, excellent. Maxwell is very complimentary of your success in the construction and design industry here. So what is the most important characteristic or mindset that you've pushed to be this successful, or that you have to be this successful?
You said it, Keith, early. Learn, 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 learn. Keep an open mind. Excellent. The world changes so fast. Just keep learning.
Cynthia is asking, besides internships or courses, what advice would you give undergraduate students who want to be competitive in the construction industry?
Understand the supply chain. That's, it's sort of hit the headlines today, but it'll probably go back to being ignored. But really understand supply chain and logistics. Incredibly important to almost anything you want to do.
Yeah, it is incredibly complex industry we're in, with so many different suppliers, contractors, designers, owners. Yeah, understanding that's so important. All right, here's another one from another Joe here. What's the best way to get experience in construction for someone who doesn't come from a construction background?
Oh boy. I would say get on the construction management side of the building owner's rep side of the business. Soft skills, scheduling, risk management analysis, those kinds of things can translate into getting access to and in contact with the actual contractors themselves. So I would recommend looking at that pathway. Owner's rep, soft CM, people who are really overseeing contractors, not actually hiring the subs and all that stuff.
I especially like that answer because that was what I did right after my undergraduate degree. So I would agree. You get to see a lot of projects. You really get to see, multiple views of it. So that's a great one. Okay, we'll give you the last one from Caitlin here, and then I'll let you close with any final thoughts before I say the thank yous. But so Caitlin's got an insightful question here, I think. How crucial are relationships in the industry?
Relationships and your reputation are all that you really have in life. I don't mean to sound like your father, but it's so true.
Great. Well, thank you for all the depth of answers and explanations you gave around P3 and your discussions of what you're doing in green infrastructure and sustainability. Joe, you really have a lot of knowledge that you've imparted today. But I'd love to give you just a few moments to close for us, and then I'll come back and say who our scholarship winner is.
Sure. I would just say, you know, from the time I began, the pace of change it just continues to accelerate in terms of expectations of clients, expectations of society, and the kind of rigors that you're going to be thrown in. So learning, and be flexible, be adaptable. Those are the keys to success on top of your personal value system and your network of peers and friends. You're in for a big ride. I wish I was young again. It's a really remarkable time period. Good luck to all of you.
Joe, thank you so much. And again, I just appreciate your time here and all your public service and everything you do to give back. So thanks so much.
All right. Thank you. Can I stay and watch the award?
Yeah. Yes,
Okay.
you certainly. Yeah. We need a drum roll, but I did want to say thank you to the NAC and all the members who make donations, who make these scholarships possible. Also, Sandy Pittman, who's oversees this, and Wayne Crew for allowing us to host this. But thank you all for being here. So our winner of the $500 scholarship is Gemma Guerra from Virginia Tech. So Gemma, congratulations. Thanks everyone for your questions and all of your time. But Gemma will be in touch via email to let you know how to get that. So thanks everyone. And Joe, thanks again.
Thank you. Take care. I enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.